It's time to start. Welcome everyone to this evening with the author Christos Chrisopoulos. And special welcome to you, of course. More about you later. This event, this evening, is part of a 3-day seminar here, an open seminar on Athens. It's called The Conversation About Athens, and it's it originates in the editorial board of a Norwegian journal for the history of ideas, and they have, with regular or irregular intervals, made special issues about important cities for thought and culture. And of course then what is more natural than at some point do an issue on Athens. So they are gathered here for 3 days, and they are, since this is history of ideas and not just a classics journal, they are interested in the whole history of Athens, not just antiquity, but the reception of antiquity, the different periods, different perspectives, and also up until the present. So earlier today, this afternoon, we have been on a graffiti tour and heard about also contemporary art in Athens. And tonight we are very happy to have with us a living author, not just a dead one. So this is the context of the event. Christos Chrisopoulos was born in Athens, and he has published 15 books in many genres, both fiction, essays, chronicle, and photography. And in 2008, he received the Academy of Athens Award for a novel. The novel is about the fragile biography of the poet, writer, and essayist Laura Rydon Jackson, who was born in 1901. And then later, in 2015, he received the French Republic title of Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters. He has also received other prizes, such as the Balkanica Prize in 2015 and the French prizes Prix L'Or Bataillon in 2013 and Prix Ravachol in 2013. And translations of his works have been published in Germany, France, Italy, and the US. And he is a member of the Greek Writers Association and the European Cultural Parliament. He has founded the Daseinfest International Literary Festival in Athens and lectures frequently on literature, theory, and politics. Chrisopoulos is also a photographer exhibiting internationally, and he is interested in the narrative connections between literature and photography. So I'm sure this will be very interesting. And so first he will give a talk, then we will have a little follow-up conversation before we leave the floor open for a broader conversation. And afterwards you will be invited for a few nibbles and some drinks in the other room. So please.
Thank you, good evening. Thank you all for coming. I mean, since we mentioned the name Ravachol, who's the guy after whom this prize was named, was a French anarchist who planted a number of bombs at different banks. So it's quite interesting because this prize was for a book which was a Parthenon Bomber. And this relates to what I will be talking briefly today about. I mean, first I'd like to thank both Jorunn and Ragni and Christine and Zarko for the invitation. Thank you all for being here. I'm quite happy because I'll be given the chance to share a few thoughts with you about issues that are interesting. I mean, in my thinking about my relationship with this town where I was born, raised, and where I now live. What I thought I'll be doing today, I mean, because when Ragnhild at the beginning said, "Oh, maybe you'll have something to talk about in the stroke," I said, "Okay, well, this is about what stems from this journal about the history of ideas, and it's an issue about Athens, and we're in Athens, and you know, I'm a writer, and I've written a book called The Parthenon Bomber." So I said, okay, what I'll do is I'll try briefly to trace like this line that connects different writers, Greek writers, contemporary writers, that they used the Parthenon and the Acropolis as a vehicle in order to comment on their own times. And almost all of them did that in a very critical manner and very destructive manner. I think at the end I might briefly, if I have the time, just mention another example which is very interesting and escapes that rule, which is a writer that is in a very interesting manner also contextualized the Acropolis, but not in order to, you know, to comment on his specific point in time, because this is how I chose these writers. They all connected the monument with specific incidents in Greek history. So you will allow me to read, and polished my English as much as I could. I hope you'll be okay. And if at any point something is not clear and you want to ask something, I mean, as I jump from one example to the next, do jump right in. Ask, and then again, we can probably have some time for a discussion. So let me just take this to the beginning. Right. So. So, as Professor Yannis Hamilakis has so eloquently written, life in Greece is inextricably intertwined with ruins. We live literally among them. We walk streets that bear ancient names, reminding us of great battles. In the summer, we flock theaters to watch tragedies being performed. Our experiences are flavored by impressions that create the image of antiquity as a lived memory. Antiquity still affects us, and foremost amongst the monuments of antiquity marking Greek history throughout its course stand the Acropolis and the Parthenon. One could assert that by writing the biography of the Acropolis, one writes a particular cultural biography of Greek society in general. The Acropolis is one of the most best known and most visited places in the world by people who recognize and admire it even if they have never visited it. In addition to its ancient glory, the Acropolis is a site that it exists both in an archaeological location and in the collective imaginings of Western tradition. So it stands both in and outside history. The Acropolis evokes not only the classical Athenians who built it, but also figures of the modern world like Melville, Thackeray, Flaubert, Freud, Hofmannsthal, Woolf, Dalrymple, Malraux, Heidegger, and others who recorded their visits in their literature and in their theory or reflection. But do Greeks care about the Acropolis? If we look at literature, we hesitate to answer. In both poetry and prose, the sacred hill appears very rarely, and when it does, it is usually an object of attack rather than admiration. Greek writers of the last 2 centuries seem profoundly uninterested in visiting or discussing the famous site. Given the importance of antiquity for modern Greek culture, as well as the centrality of the Acropolis in the literature of travels to Greece, the literary stance is puzzling. Today I will try to delineate the existence of a pattern that, in my opinion, could function as one of the most effective metaphors about modern Greek identity. This pattern regards the depiction of the Acropolis in modern literature and can be described as follows. In periods of crisis, that is, every time Greek society found it hard to project its collective aspirations and favorable self-image on the Acropolis. To put it simply, whenever it was hard to convincingly appropriate the symbolisms of classical grandeur, there was always some writer who was reflecting on this aversion in writing by destroying the monument. And so I'll start with my first example. Nicholas Callas. The start of our trajectory is, in my mind, intertwined with the advent of modernism in Greece, and we can talk about this later if you want, and can be traced back in the 1930s with surrealist poet Nicholas Callas. In his 1933 collection Poems, published under the pseudonym Nikitas Randos, Callas includes the poem Acropolis, in which he creates a very strong image of a destroyed Acropolis full of rubbish, discarded packagings, coins, and posterites. I'll say a few things about him for people who are not familiar with Nicholas Callas. He was born Nikos Kalamaris in Lausanne in Switzerland in May 27, 1907, but grew up in Athens. Although he worked in a law office between 1930 and 1934, he soon abandoned this career to concentrate on his writing, poetry, literary and political critique, often highly polemical in both style and content. Callas' critical work, mostly published under the pseudonym Manolis Spieros, influenced by Robespierre, was published in a string of literary and political journals in Greece between 1929 and 1938. He covered a wide range of subjects, such as cinema, politics, and literary criticism, and he was the first critic to analyze the poetry of Constantine Cavafy from a Freudian Marxist perspective. Callas' poetry, on the other hand, published under the pseudonym Nikitas Randos, went through several stylistic changes which reflected his artistic curiosity and interest in the modernist trends of the early 20th century, Futurism, Expressionism, and Surrealism. When his debut Poems was published in 1932, Callas was instantly recognized as one of the first true modernists in Greece. Being clearly ahead of his time, Callas suffered considerable negative criticism and in the end emigrated first to France and then in the US. It's interesting to say things about his writings. After that, he arrived in New York as one of the first émigré surrealists of the 1940s and lived there until his death in 1988. He worked mainly as an art critic for several leading journals, such as The View, The Village Voice, and Art Forum. Many of his essays were collected in volumes. The interesting thing about it, to cut this a little bit short, is that his archives are located at the Nordic Library in Athens, and these are all his writings in English. So, going back to his first collection, in the section of the book titled Roar, we find the poem Acropolis. Acropolis. In the foreground, the Parthenon, the poison with Psycharis ink, the false, the dead, the killed by a lance and precious paper from Boissonnat, Greece's gravedigger. In the background, crossed hands, tangled in prayer, intensive prayer, fat, vulgar hands, extremely fat, instead of rings round the fingers, electric wires that flicker the word Renan, the official of the Acropolis candle boy. On the marbles, legs, belly, breasts, hands, loose hair of Dalida, but the hair is cut short. The dancer, bored with the parquet, jumps on old marbles provocatively, jumps between the pillars, eloquently positioned there by a poet too great, hair called Baedeker, and all that in some commercial in Zapion, French label, beaten sadistically by the spotlight, punching our ears, it has decided, the rascal, to rhyme with the moon. On full moon nights, the taxman receives all the kisses concealed by fake carroted skirts, leaving behind his thick belly. Among them 600 tubes, cylinders, straight fallen pillars, roller film, Agfa, Kodak, coins of exchanged dollars and sterling, also cylindrical. Juicy words, words inspired from the horror provoked by the Morosini cannonballs, the cannons themselves cylindrical. Every day they destroy the Acropolis, every day they destroy the citadels, others are restoring on negative plaques. The Kodak clicks, are screaming words she recites with an engine speed, a lady actor prostituting her ears with a weak throat, draining her soul which finally pours out in applause. Black foam of some Venetian sea. Callas depicts the Parthenon as dead and devastated in a movement that resembles a cinematic sequence, unfolding the instigators of this disaster. He mocks the Franco-Swiss photographer Fred Boissonat, representing him as the Parthenon gravedigger, disapproving of his idyllic imagery in his well-known pictures of the early 20th century. This is one example of Boissonat photographs. Disapproving, of course, his idyllic imagery. Callas' sarcasm is also targeted to Ernest Renan for his famous prayer in the Acropolis, reserving to him the position of the candle boy. He then cast his headlights on the naked dancers of the Greek photographer Nelly, who have found a new parquet on the Pentelic marbles, contributing even more to the reputation of the monument. These are examples of the Nelly photographs on the right. On the left is Boissonat on the hill with his camera. Even the well-known Carl Baedeker guides, the travel gospel of his time, is also repudiated. In general, Callas cast his arrows to all those who saw the Parthenon as an opportunity to display a varnished image of antiquity and made it the object of demonstration, exploitation, and advertising. Callas foresees here the idealization of the monument as a ruin and highlights the upcoming explosion of the illusionary reality that tourism brought after the war, whilst he is also mocking the establishment of the Acropolis as a national monument. As Professor Vasilis Lambropoulos notes, quotation marks, Callas presents the Acropolis as a monument overridden by commercial, technological, and national forces. Instead of praising the transcendental qualities of the monument, he sees it as something vulnerable and defenseless. According to Callas, the Acropolis is dead, killed by all those who supposedly wanted to praise it. But the biggest challenge in the poem is a comparison of the Morosini bombs that fell on the hill, blowing up the Parthenon during the Venetian turmoil in 1687, with the destruction brought about by photographic film, the cinema cameras, and the blinding projectors of the commercial exhibitions. Quotation marks. I'm not at all sure whether Morosini hasn't in fact contributed a lot to the beauty of the Parthenon. Callas wrote in his essay about modern art, 1931. In another text, titled Black Flames, Callas claims that if Morosini did not exist, we would not have understood the magnificence of the Acropolis, ending with a rhetorical question. Do you prefer Morosini or Phidias, the car or the accident? But what is the source of Callas' radicalism against the Acropolis? He himself related the writing of this poem to the miserable state of the refugees from Asia Minor who flocked Athens after the end of the 1922 campaign. For those who are interested in Callas himself talking about it, this is in the archives of the National Broadcaster. He talks about this in particular. For Callas, the awful living conditions of refugees camping rough across Athens, even among the classical ruins, resembled in his imagination the Acropolis after the explosion of Morosini. And these are different examples of the refugees camping in Athens. This is also particularly interesting. This is in Theseo. The next trace of our pattern appears in 1944. So we got this example which relates this poem to the Asia Minor campaign. The next example appears with Yorgos Makris in 1944. At the age of 20, Athens-born Makris wrote a pamphlet which he circulated in November 1944 under the title Proclamation No. 1, Let's Destroy the Acropolis, in which he was calling for the destruction of all ancient monuments, propaganda against antiquities, and things we generally dislike. This pamphlet was collectively signed by SASA, Society of Aesthetic Saboteurs of Antiquities, and it appeared only a few months after the liberation of Athens from the Nazi forces and a few weeks before the outbreak of the Greek Civil War, which in Greece is marked by the Cambrian now, that is December 1944. But who was Yorgos Makris? Let's listen to writer Leonidas Christakis, who had known him well. Yorgos Makris was born in Athens in 1923 to extremely strict parents. He was an only child. His father was in the judiciary, and his authoritarian character led him to exercise his profession even within the family circle. He was conducting fake trials. At the age of 6, Yorgos Makris was injured by a car crash that lamed him and made it difficult for him to walk for the rest of his life. He registered as a student in the law school in Athens, but never set foot in the place. He learned French, German, and English, and manically read all the important writers of the time. From 1948 onwards, he lived practically alone. He had no particular interests and went from one cafe to the other, from bar to bar, negligently spending his mother's money and then finding himself broke for weeks. He wasn't very talkative, but he had a great sense of humor. He always had a book or a magazine in his hand that he'd spend his time reading sprawled in a chair in a tea salon or cafe on Kolonaki Square. Sometimes he'd settle down in a cafe and not leave for 24 hours. At other times, he'd stay shut up in his room. He wrote, translated, and maintained a correspondence with friends and acquaintances. His writings showed the influence of post-war existentialist ideas. His poems, he wrote mostly poetry, more often than not reflected his psychological or emotional state. I'll jump, some of the rest. And I'll get to the end of January 1968, which was the month where he committed suicide. And this is Leonidas Christakis talking about that day. At the end of January 1968, he came to my place in the middle of the day. He looked pale and thin. We had lunch, and afterwards he said, "I'm ashamed of being unable to put a definite end to my life." Then he left. I kept calling him on the phone, but he didn't answer. I went to see him at his place, 4 Cemetery Street. He was obviously in great mental distress and completely confused. I suggested that he should go to France and consult a doctor I trusted. He said he didn't have a passport. On January 31st, in the evening, someone called up and told me Yorgos had fallen from the roof terrace of his apartment building. Just before, in answer to a question from the doorman, he had said, "I'll be right down." He was identified from the passport found in his pocket. Now, again, Christakis talking about the proclamation. Now and again, in suitable circumstances, Yorgos Makris would make various remarks which many of his hearers regarded as extremist ideas, and which they took seriously enough to store in their memory. Among the targets of the criticisms he spouted in cafes or in friends' houses of those days was the national obsession with ancestry, which he considered responsible for Greece's intellectual and ideological decline. And, depending on the makeup of his audience, he might end with the recommendation, "Raise the Acropolis." This idea appeared in print in a proclamation he published on November 18, 1944. The inspiration for his text, however, came from the surrealist poet Nikitas Randos, or Nikolas Kallas, or Manolis Pieros, pseudonyms of Niko Kalamaris, who in 1935 had himself fervently championed this cause in conversations with a circle of friends, before whom he proclaimed Nikolas Kallas, not in a nihilistic spirit, but rather with the idea of renovating the philosophical tendencies prevalent in the period. "Let's blow up the Parthenon. Its influence on philosophy is deadly." I'll jump right down to the proclamation of Makris, and then, if you're interested, we can talk more about it. Blow up the Acropolis. Society of Aesthetic Saboteurs of Antiquities. Proclamation number 1. having in common an aesthetic and a worldview that comprehend the destruction and mortality of all forms of being as an integral part of life. Having set as our goal the destruction of the Parthenon, with a further goal the rendition thereof to its essential eternity, which is nothing more or less than the standardized flux of unconscious form, including in all likelihood a spontaneous transmutation of matter, which we erroneously call loss. Considering that man is doubtless nothing other than an indirect automatism and a natural resolvous manifestation, and in any case recognizing that a work of art is something fundamentally foreign to life, and detesting the temporal and historical conservation of such a work, having understood that the necessity of eternity is one of the fundamental presuppositions of life and therefore of art, since art is but a subversive adaptation of life's fundamental instincts, and moreover understanding that only this necessity is indispensable at the moment of creation. Acknowledging Salvador Dali, who had the audacity to compose a work of art made of raw meat and vegetables, no matter whether he mentally intended the work for eternally for God or for himself, those words all having the same meaning from the human point of view, although their essence is underappreciated. And therefore acknowledging the said artist as equal to Phidias, who did indeed assure his work a permanence through the ages, but achieved nothing more within the framework of existential eternity, which knows neither number nor duration, and for which a second is equivalent to 3 billion centuries, thanks to its volitional qualities and total dynamism, which have no meaning except at the atomic level, irrespective of the quantity of the atoms themselves. Observing that the notion of the conservation of an art through time and history is what is most foreign and illusory for mankind, and therefore abhorring the national tourist organization and the nightmarish journalism apropos, convinced that we are preparing a spiritually and artistically superior action, and proud thereof in both its aesthetic and its vital dimensions, as we institute this form of nihilism, and being certain that a ridiculous and illusory survival cannot be compared to a single minute of energetic and enjoyable activity, and moreover that the said survival is artistically harmful, for it forces only amateur tourists and eunuchs, along with onanistic contemporary poets and painters, even if, as in present case, the said survival stems from a historical and aesthetic cycle that is not ours, we have determined 1. To fix as our clear objective the destruction by explosion of ancient monuments and the dissemination of propaganda against antiquities as well as against everything we dislike. 2. To make our first act of destruction and explosion the definite demolition of the Parthenon, which is literally suffocating us. This is interesting. He indicates that there were 10 articles in this proclamation. When this proclamation was published after his death in his collected writings, which is I don't have the book here, which is this book, items 3 through 9 were missing. If you want, we can talk about that. I mean, in my understanding, they were purposefully omitted from the book by the publishers, and the book was published in 1986. The last article, the goal of this proclamation is merely to declare the scale of the goals we have set for ourselves. We launch dismissal with little chance of reaching most people, but in point of fact, our targets constitute only a small minority. In Macquarie's case, the destruction of the Acropolis could be seen as a lesson against the tyranny of history. Professor Chrisopoulos claimed that the pamphlet is a violent protestation against the profanation of the Acropolis when the swastika was raised next to the Parthenon. Keep in mind that this proclamation was published in 1944, just right after the liberation from Nazi forces. Such a claim sounds convincing if we take into account the historical moment and the fact that Macris had been held at a Nazi camp in Greece. In the fall of 1943, he was sent to a German concentration camp in Tripoli, where he remained a long time and barely escaped execution. Every morning, and this are recounted again by Leonidas Christakis. Every morning a German would come into the inmates' quarters, and with Yorgos' help, Yorgos knew German, he'd call out the prisoner who was slated for execution that day. Years later, some doctor from Argos, who had lost his son to the Germans, circulated a notebook in which he'd written down his recollections. In one passage, he made the vague allusion to Macris, characterizing him without any explanation as a traitor. Only because Yorgos spoke German and the Germans had used him as an interpreter. That accusation haunted Macris incessantly, persistently, and I would say pathologically, says Christakis. All conversations ended up with him asking, why did they think I was a traitor? It is evident that Macris followed the lineage of the Dades and the Surrealists, but his gesture carries connotations that are particular to the politics and the historical concerns that blighted Greece in those days. And this is the collected works of Yorgos Macris. Our next attempt of literary destruction appears in the mid-1970s and regards a decade between 1965 and 1975. Kostas Montis was an influential and prolific Cypriot poet, novelist, and playwright. He was born on February 18, 1914, in Famagusta, and died on March 1, 2004. He received numerous honors and awards throughout his life, and his books have been translated into several languages. He was even nominated for the Nobel Prize. In his collection Anthology of Moments, 1958-1975, he includes an untitled poem dedicated to the Acropolis. And through it, he creates a very poignant criticism of the political, social, and ideological instabilities in Cyprus that eventually led to the partition of the island at a time when the junta, the colonists, was ruling in Greece. And we all know its archaeolatric fervor. This is the poem. Wherever the Acropolis might be, it does not exist without us. Wherever the Acropolis might be, she should know it. She stands on our shoulders. With all due respect, we have more serious concern than the Acropolis. Well, she sat long enough on our heads, that Acropolis. If it was up to me, I would forbid, I tell you, all excavations. You can't be born with the Acropolis on your head. You can't have all your life the Acropolis on your head. What is the aim of this total negation of the monument? Professor Liana Giannopoulos states that Montis included this previously unpublished poem in his collection, expressing his anger for the outcome of the Cyprus negotiations, in which the Acropolis had played a double role. On the one hand, the return of the Parthenon sculptures from the British Museum was used by the British side as leverage during the negotiations, so that the Greek side would retract its support of the Cypriot demand for independence. Whilst, on the other hand, the Greek junta exploited the symbolisms of the Acropolis to propagate the annexation of the island, leading to disastrous results. These are two cases. The first one is from Makronsos, which was a camp where communists and other dissidents were held. One of the so-called exercises of rehabilitation was that they were put into this position where they created small replicas of the Parthenon, and the soldiers would destroy them and they would have to rebuild them. And this is from Yanis Hamlakis, but the picture below is from one of the fiestas of Greek war grandeur held by the junta, and this is in the Panathinaikos Stadium. Now, this very sharp lines of Kostas Montis brings us. This is another interesting example, because during those times, the Acropolis was used as it has happened in many cases, even very recently, as a place where contrasting political interests are portrayed. This is a case where a flag, a specific flag that relates to the anti-junta struggle, was raised on the Acropolis on July 1962. And before last, we come to the case of Christos Chrisopoulos. Let's keep in mind we have first this example that relates to the Asia Minor catastrophe or campaign. Then we got Greece after the war and before the Civil War. Then we had the secret question. So we go from the 1940s, 30s to the 1920s, really, to the 1940s to the 1970s. Now we're in the 1980s. In 1988, Christos Chrisopoulos publishes his short story 24 Hours for the Acropolis in his story collection Athenian Stories. Chrisopoulos was born in Athens, grew up in the district of Kypseli, which he details at length in his works. And I think I'll go straight into, this is the book. Actually it was 1988, not 1989. And I'm going to read you this short story. It's rather short and funny. 24 Hours for the Acropolis. 5 minutes before the bus from Xanthi reached Larissa station in Athens, Lazaros Georgiadis sank in the same bad dream that he had been struggling with every night for the last 15 days. The Acropolis was suddenly collapsing in a cloud of dust. A group of tourists was watching in awe and then was walking away cheering. Lazaros had woken up coughing last night, as if that dream dust had destroyed his lungs. He was tortured with agony, and in his blurred mind he told himself, "Get down there for a day to set things right." The first time that he had that dream, Lazaros had laughed and had started the day drinking a glass of red wine. Every time the dream returned since then, his mood was swaying down even more, and Lazaros kept on adding glasses of wine to keep it up. Yesterday he had drunk a whole bottle. He got on the bus to Athens half drunk. The nightmare started again, but the bus driver cut it short. Lazaros woke up and looked at his watch. It was 5:45 and he had 16 hours to figure out what he was supposed to do. He got off the bus and asked the first man he saw the way to Ammonia Square. The man explained, and Lazaros walked somewhat restlessly in the direction that he had indicated to him. "It is a matter of tactics," said the young man with the round glasses. "They leave a few freedoms and then they're taking them back, you know." "You're very young," said the wretched old man holding the sports newspaper. "You have years ahead of you." Lazaros approached the company. He had seen the Acropolis from Athena Street. She was still standing. But there was something wrong with Ammonia Square. "Freedom comes in small drops," said the young man with the round glasses. "Has anything been destroyed around here?" Lazaros asked. This question went unnoticed. "There is no absolute freedom," said the wretched elderly, his sporting newspaper still in his hands. Lazaros asked again, "Has anything been destroyed around here?" They all looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" asked the young man with the round glasses. Lazaros pointed towards the square. No one seemed to understand what he meant. At 10 o'clock, the Acropolis was still in its place, and Lazaros walked up Stadiou Street. He had thought to visit the hill, but he was ashamed. One needs to go with a guide, hear all sorts of explanations. You can't just stand and look dumb. There were foreigners there, serious people, organized into groups, most of them already knowing everything about it. Only that she does not fall, Lazaros thought about the Acropolis. When he came to Korai Street, he stood for a moment. He remembered that in that street he had seen buses in the past, and now all he could see was a pile of burnt trees lying on the pavement. The street itself was gone. Lazarus approached the nearby kiosk, took a walk around it, and then asked the kiosk keeper if there had been buses there in the past. "Oh, back in those days," said the kiosk keeper. "Were there any disasters? Why are they gathering the burnt trees?" asked Lazarus. "The mayor put them there," the keeper replied. "What are they?" Lazarus asked. "Oh, they will take them tomorrow," said the keeper. "They will put some iron poles in their place." "I know all about iron," said Lazarus. "Do they have enough iron bars?" A fat lady with dyed blonde hair came to ask for foreign cigarettes. Lazarus walked away from the kiosk and, without looking at the burnt trees, went to Syntagma Square. Outside Asti Cinema, he thought he noticed the young man from Monia Square, and he decided to follow him. The young man with the round glasses crossed Syntagma Square, turned on Acropolis Street, went up Niki Street, and entered a betting shop on Apollonis Street. Lazarus hesitated a little, and then went in after him. He took a betting card and sat down on a table. A man was switching stations on a red radio behind the counter. Lazarus began filling a betting slip. The young man came and sat beside him. "You were in Ammonia in the morning, right?" he asked. "Yes," said Lazarus. "Panathinaikos will win Xanthi in the next match," said the man. "No way," said Lazarus. "I am from Xanthi, I know." The young man jumped on his toes as if struck by electric current. He stood for a second on his right leg and then approached the betting agent and said something to him. The agent immediately shut the radio off. "Panathinaikos is a favorite. What do you know about the match?" "I know that Xanthi is flying," Lazarus said. "That's very important," said the agent. "Should I order some ouzo?" "Why not?" said Lazarus. The young man took a walk around the table and then went out to the street minding his own business. "I'll get a machine that destroys negative ions in the atmosphere," said the agent. "One what?" said Lazarus, already shunned by those. The young man with the round glasses returned, bringing a number of people who were all talking about the same thing. What state was the Xanthi football club in? They talked incredibly loud, and they were quarreling. Suddenly Lazarus remembered the Acropolis. "Is she still okay?" he asked. "Which?" asked the agent. Lazarus didn't answer. He stood up and went out Apollonis Street. His head was spinning. He turned from Voulis Street to Metropolis Street. Voices and sirens were heard somewhere near. Lazarus followed the sound trail, and after a while he got himself lost in Monastiraki. He eventually revealed the source of all this rabble. The commercial store was on fire. "The baby!" screamed a woman. Without understanding how, Lazarus was in the shop fighting with the flames. A little later, he was back in the street with a baby in his hands. The woman grabbed it and ran away. All this happened in 2 minutes, and all the bystanders screaming in front of the shop did not seem to give any value to the incident. Lazarus walked away and found himself again on Metropolis Street. He turned from Voulis Street to Apollonis Street. Behind the betting shop, the young man with the round glasses was draining a small bottle of ouzo. Lazarus looked at his watch. Half a day had gone by. He had a mission to accomplish. He had come to sell the Acropolis affair, and he had done nothing. The wretched old man with the sports newspaper was still in the same place, talking as if nothing had happened. Lazarus approached and stood beside him. "The only thing that remains to us is to forget it all," the old man said, "to take things in our hands." The conversation was cut then and there because a short guy appeared holding some tickets to the football match. "I do not talk to Jehovah's Witnesses," said the wretched old man. "If you wish, you may open your own discussion. How dare you barge into our own discussions like that?" and turned his back on Lazarus. The Acropolis was still in its place. The bus left Athens in a thick morning fog. Lazarus tried to close his eyes and immediately opened them again. His nerves were tense. Even the young girl in the next seat appeared rather annoying to him. "You were in business?" asked the enigmatic figure. "I had work to do, but it didn't happen," said Lazarus. She snapped a cigarette, pulled 2 puffs, and threw it in the seat tray. Everybody goes for work and returns with nothing, you see, she said. I did nothing, said Lazarus. She looked at him a bit puzzled, then turned the other way. The fog was thickening. Every so often a car was passing, a house, a ruin, a piece of half-cultivated expanse. Everything was flickering on and off like a dream. Maybe it was all about the baby, Lazarus thought. This is the end of the story. I'll have a few minutes and then I'll wrap it up. I just wanted to point to the fact that Acropolis connects this story to the environmental and the urban crisis in Greece in the 1980s. This is a story of the photochemical smog on top of Athens. And this story portrays Athens like a city in disarray. Lazarus just walks to the town and never gets himself in the Acropolis. In fact, only once he gets, gets a very short glimpse of it from Athens Street, and that's it. The interesting thing about it is that during the same time, there was a proclamation that was published from one of the terrorist groups that was active at the time. They were responsible for the arson of 2 department stores in Athens, in which they claimed that they had planted explosives in the Acropolis, and they asked that if the government did not remove all polluting industries from Attica, the whole region, within 17 days, they would blow up the Acropolis. No one really knows if this was a real proclamation or not, or if it was a hoax, because it never appeared in the newspapers at the Times, because it was forbidden for the media to reproduce in those days the proclamations. This appeared in an article in 2010. So this sort of wraps it up. At the end, I would make a very short notice on my book, which is the Parthenon Bomber, because it just somehow creates a circle that engulfs all that. In this book, there's a young man who is inspired by Macris, and at the end succeeds in blowing up the Parthenon. At the end of the book, a new Parthenon will be built to replace the old one. And I mean, there's no reason to talk about it because I'm here at the one. I mean, we can talk about the book itself. But I wanted just to make just one last note about the lineage that I just traced. The last book I wanted to notice, which is not here, it's a book by Vasilis Gourogiannis. It's a very interesting, very funny book for those who are interested. It was published in the 1990s. In that book, it's a very sarcastic postmodern novel. There's a Turkish F-16 that passes in supersonic speed in a low pass above the Parthenon, and because of the bad vibrations, the Parthenon straightens. This idea that there's no straight line in the Acropolis, and because there's no straight line, everything looks straight. Now it looks straight. Now it's straight, and for that reason it looks crooked. And there's a whole really funny story of how they tried to make it crooked again, so it's straight. So thank you so much. This was just the line that I wanted to through, and I hope I didn't bore you to death.
Thank you so much for this, in a way, both a presentation of the issues of Acropolis, but also a survey of your predecessors, as we can see here. We've also been writing about it. Of course, as a foreigner, who have not grown up in this country, this line is not a line I'm very familiar with, I have to say, but there were some issues that I thought we just might elaborate a little bit on that will also relate to the topic of the larger conference or seminar that this this whole thing is a part of. And in a way, coming here to have a seminar on Athens and the conversation, wanting for people from like the opposite side of Europe wanting to come to Athens to have a conversation about Athens, is in a way also imposing ourselves on this kind of this, I don't know what to call it, tradition or a line or whatever, and as someone who kind of stands between and kind of facilitating these things, but also trying to be kind of liaise with Greek culture more broadly and try to bring two together, I'm also made to feel a little bit kind of self-conscious about the project. And so when you said this thing about, you know, that Lazarus in the last novel cannot go, he wants to go through the Acropolis, but he feels he can't go because he can't go there without the guide. And why can't he go there without the guide? Because the place is full of tourists. And you know, and you can't, you know, people who don't understand, who come from, you know, you can't let them loose. And we were also talking about this earlier in the week, that people.
Well, actually, it's interesting that because I noticed that in the story he says that Lazarus feels ashamed, and that's why he goes there, because all these guys up here, you know everything, and then you can't just. Actually, he said you can't stay. Like deaf and dumb. So I think in this, I mean, it's actually quite common that because you find it in some of the writings of the other writers as well, that they comment on this sort of like an inferiority complex that has to do with how modern Greeks stand against classical heritage. So yes, I mean, you're very right to point this out. I think it's interesting that it starts, I mean, this lineage starts from the 1930s with the advent of tourism, and also the advent of modernism in Greece, because as a movement, you know, all the modernists were studying themselves as you know, the opposite to classical academic ideas that would be either in writing or in academia. And in Greece, they're always so intertwined with classical antiquity. So it was also, in some sense, like an easy target.
Yeah, so it wasn't that all the guards and all the fences and everything that had to be introduced was kind of introducing some form of kind of visible alienation. No, it wasn't.
I think, I mean, this is something that you can trace even before that. I mean, before even the physical barriers. Like over there, I mean, you see the picture in Western Island, people just go right in. And actually, I've talked to a number of people who knew Macaris when I was researching for the book, and even they claimed that even until the 1950s, you could just walk into the Parthenon itself. So it was a different understanding, and it's interesting to think about also this the conservation process. What does it reconstitute? What sort of monument is the monument that we see today? Did it ever exist in this form? And probably never. And this relates to the Morozini, the fact that a lot of traces, either Ottoman, Christian, were just taken away.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about that. So Elias spoke on the Ottoman period today. He said, well, next time you go up there, you have to go inside and you see the foundations of the minaret. And I said, well, you know, you can't go in there anymore. You know, and he said, oh well, you know, you just talk to the guards, and I hope they will not remove it. He said, but much has been removed already.
I mean, even the you know, the monument is already split as it is today, because a lot of the you know, Christian findings are in the Christian and Byzantine Museum, rather than the Acropolis Museum. So it's interesting to talk about.
Yeah, and the ones that are on the Acropolis Museum are there on the third floor, a little bit kind of hidden away. You don't really understand what they're doing there. Yeah, And a similar phenomenon that I also wanted to just check with you was the kind of slightly, you said surrealist, but also kind of whether it was also a critical tone when Nicolas Callas was kind of discussing these danseuses, you know, and everything that was, you know, everyone who wanted to come to the Acropolis to present themselves in a good light. It's also some of this kind of imposing on the heritage. And was that more explicit with him than with what you have now explained from the later novel?
Yeah, I mean, to me they just follow the same.
Okay.
On the same line. It's interesting that also in the 1930s Marinetti visited Athens, and you know, the Futurist Manifesto was already written, and there's a short interview of Marinetti in one of the Athenian papers at the Times, and they asked him whether we should just get rid of the Acropolis. So what does he think now that he saw the Acropolis? And he draws this metaphor that the Parthenon, as it stands with all the pillars, it's like a cage. So modern Greece is just kept hostage within this cage. So I mean, you see, there's a lot of these ideas that keep on returning. But at the same time, I mean, we have other examples of you know, destruction of monuments across Europe. Even before that, I mean, I like talking about this example of Courbet during the French Commune. There was this deal in Place Vendôme, and he asked for it to be demolished. And Napoleon was on top, and it was demolished. And there's a very nice, very early picture of him standing with the rest of the comrades, and still was down in shadows. I mean, afterwards, of course, it was rebuilt. And he was put on trial, and he was fined, I don't know how many thousand francs at the time, for rebuilding. And it's allegedly one of the reasons why he left France was he didn't have money to pay for it.
Yeah, and what you say there also connects to another topic that I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on. And it was like when you started to say this thing about Greeks are kind of also surrounded by ruins all the time, and the ruins is kind of so much part of daily life, and becomes in a way part of the way of thinking, of identity. And then, you know, and I wonder, does this play also into the modern period, in that, you know, buildings are not always finished, or that, you know, you just add a little extension here and a little extension there, and you just build a little bit on a plot you shouldn't. So there's all buildings are never, you build them and then it's finished, and then they're there. It's like there is always with buildings here, it seems to me in the present also, there's always either expansion or retraction. It's like a building is never stable, and I wonder if this is what it does to you to live among ruins.
Well, it's interesting to see that. And others have also noticed that. I mean, actually, I have friends who noticed that. It never occurred to me in that sense, really. I had a friend after she came from Sweden, and we were walking around Athens, and she said, "Oh, it's like a museum. Everything seems half destroyed." And then I had the father of a German friend who came over, and he's a developer, and he was looking at the house, and I said, there's a lot of work to be done around here. But again, I mean, you visit other places in the south of Europe, you see the same thing. I mean, you go to the Balkans, you see the same thing. I wouldn't relate that specifically to that situation, though there is, and I mentioned that there is a sense of idealization of the ruin. And you see that in the way that I mean, actually you can see that in graves. I remember when my father died, so we had to, I mean, my mother had to pick up like a tombstone for my dad. And it was very fashionable at the time that the stone it wasn't just rectangular, and it was also as if it was broken. So there was, this line here, there was my father's photograph. So somehow it resonates something that has to do with the questions of time or memory or whatever. But there is this idealization of the ruin that we have connected classical antiquity with the image of the ruin. That is also in many cases why when a monument is reconstructed in full, it looks fake. For example, you can see that in the Christos Chrisopoulos, which is the only one that was reconstructed. Interestingly enough, there's a theory about the idealization of ruins, which is even earlier than that. And it was by Albert Speer, who was the architect for Hitler. And it's called ruin value theory. And he proposed that when Germania would be built, like this new capital for the Third Reich, which was supposed to last for 1,000 years, we had to think ahead how buildings will collapse. And if they would collapse, they would have to collapse in an aesthetically pleasing way. And his, of course, ideal was Greco-Roman antiquity. So you see, there is these things somehow become part of popular culture in many ways. So they are part of a pot where things are brewing.
Yeah, and he was probably then speaking on top of the tradition of was it the historians of it, was it Friedrich the Große who was building artificial ruins in these parks?
Was pretty much everyone was building artificial
ruins. Yeah. So there was definitely a pleasing way that the ruin should look, and if you didn't have one in your garden, you would build one. But I'm also struck. This is my last point about the. How in Norway we have almost a fear of ruins, so we don't want to see them. So either a building should be erect properly and very well maintained. Norwegians have a world record in maintaining their houses and refurbishing them all the time. And then if it's not there, it should be completely demolished. And this leads to a lot of public. So like you have the Acropolis, but in Norway we have constant discussions about public buildings. So now it has been ongoing for, I'm sure, well, since 2011 and the explosion in the government headquarters with Anders Behring Breivik, whether the building should be torn down, etc. And then there is one fresco by Picasso on one of the buildings that takes up a lot of space, and it's like there doesn't seem to be a middle way, because either you have to remove everything or you have to let everything stand. It's like, why not create a ruin? You can keep the things that you find most interesting, and then you will have an organic trans-historical urban space, and you can build a new parts. But this is an idea that is absolutely not viable in Norway.
Well, the only thing that it's really interesting. The other thing to consider is that this is a living city, and it is a living city for quite a long time. Even though it has blown out of proportions recently. In those days, Athens was fairly small. But still, what happens? There are all these, archaeological layers and architectural layers. So, what do you preserve and what you don't? We were discussing the other day. We know that there are finds at different parts of the city. Would you unearth them or not? If you do that, where are other people going to live? There's also a lot of discussion about that, and what you keep and what you don't. And this also happens in Athens as well, because it has to be lived by its people.
Yeah. Okay, I think we will expand the conversation at this point and invite everyone to comment or questions or whatever.
Or we can do it with a glass of wine. Maybe it will.
We can, but we can see it first if we can tempt someone to.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we shouldn't forget that the Norwegian situation is absolutely normal. So you are normal to not want any ruins. Okay. Once upon a time, the Parthenon was intact and beautiful and perfect. Okay. problem is that the historical accidents, and not just accidents, created this mess. The Greek soul is wounded, just like the Parthenon is wounded.
Okay. Yeah. And excuse me, you had your hand up as well? Yeah?
Yeah, it creates a problem and the challenge the Parthenon, meaning that being the root of Western philosophy, it also is a monument to causality, to cause and effect, which doesn't stand well with the Greek way of thinking and acting. Therefore, instead of seeing this problem as something to overcome, like the cocoon to become a butterfly, one other way is to get away with it and move on.
You want to?
No, it's. I mean, I just wanted to comment that. I mean, why should we? I mean, I agree. It's a very good. Why should we consider it a problem? I mean, it's not a problem. It's an issue, and there are different ways to approach it. I mean, this was just manifested right now. The thing is that there's no sense in getting rid of things that were done in the past and the way people dealt with their heritage. People did that, and I mean, these are some examples. We have other examples that stands on the opposite side. For me, what's interesting is to have a consciousness of all these, contrasting views, and the fact that it's still an issue today, and how this translates into, political decisions. That then reflect a lot on things that influence our education, the way history is written, and even our current day politics. But in no way these things are, we don't bring anything new into the discussion. These are things we already know, and they're very well written and very well recorded. So they are part of the discourse, and probably will be so for the years to come.
Yeah. Any new revolutionary ideas on how to transform the Acropolis? Well, maybe your suggestion is the best one after all, to just continue the conversation over a glass of wine. But I'm sure everyone will want to join in. Thank you one more time.